Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Hello, good people. This is Chris, and I'm joined by Eric Bond with Welcome to A Fork in Time. Eric, would you like to say hello to the good people?
No.
Okay,
Also,
cool.
hello, good people.
Um,
I'm so sorry.
yeah, no, I actually threatened him beforehand that he can't actually just go right into that because that is my trademark. You'll be hearing from my attorneys. So, we're here recording another episode in kind of this Rome track we've been on. And Eric, do you want to go ahead and set up what we're thinking about here? What today's fork is?
Oh, I would love to. So it is the year 41 AD, January 24th, and, a lot of things drop during January. It's known as like a time when if you have a terrible movie uh, that's being produced, it typically gets dropped in January. So do Roman emperors, namely the Emperor Caligula, who is assassinated by a like a cadre of senators, his own guards, and one very annoyed guard named Cassius Crea, who Caligula keeps making fun of for his effeminate voice.
Okay.
That's
And
literally what he kept
yeah,
saying was his main motivation.
so this actually happens. What is our fork here?
So our fork is that following the assassination in the world's greatest game of hide and seek, the members of the conspiracy are able to kill basically the entire Julian Claudian Roman family, which at this point is primarily just the Claudius, the emperor's, the dead emperor's uncle.
So in our timeline, anybody who took entirely too much Latin in high school like I did, you watched I Claudius, and at this point he is discovered behind a curtain,
A curtain.
generally by the assassins, and there's with a lot of things he's generally portrayed sometimes as a stutterer, a little slow. There's a little question as to whether this is him actually putting on an act so that he's not seen as a threat by, I mean, just so many people around him have these accidents happening, especially throughout
Yeah,
his
and
entire life.
and he would even say during his own reign that he played up his nervous tics to try and make himself look less threatening.
And because he looks less threatening, and what could be less threatening than somebody who is literally hiding behind curtains, in our timeline, the assassins stumble upon him, and I don't know how much first person research there is behind this, but in I Claudius, which we're going to take as truth for this point, um, the German guard discovers him and in somewhat of a dim-witted moment pronounces him Kaiser, which we all know that that's the German for Caesar and all of these things. So in our timeline, that pays off. They do find him, and they kind of, I guess, he did play it up, and it paid off for him, and he does become emperor as kind of these assassins look at him. We don't need to talk about Caligula. He was crazy. Um, some of these assassins probably carried that out for self-preservation. They thought, there were plenty of unfortunate accidents happening to people at a certain rank, and many of these assassins probably thought they wouldn't be very far behind, and that they wouldn't have to worry about this from Claudius. Is that a pretty fair statement?
Yeah, that's a pretty fair statement. Claudius pretty much gave a blanket pardon to most of them. he said they went a little too far in murdering the wife and daughter of Caligula, but for the most part, everybody kind of agreed Caligula was crazy.
So they install Claudius, and we're going to get to a little bit about the importance of Claudius. Do you have anything else before we kind of go back and start the fork?
Well, I think it's just important to say that Claudius was probably like, for 12 years, he was seen as like a relief period. Nobody really thought highly of him, but it was just seen as like, oh, finally, a stable administrator after all this time. But we're going to get more into that and what was kind of the cultural attitudes towards the emperors and the Senate.
So let's throw a little bit back to there. Geez, very quickly, for pretending people don't know a whole lot. I'm trying to think about when this would be released, and just very quickly, Caesar was assassinated. Augustus took over. We had the Battle of Actium episode. Augustus kind of established the Pax Romana. When he died, his adopted son took over. That was Tiberius.
That was Tiberius who then took over. Tiberius ruled for the most part fairly well, but towards the end relied more on his Praetorian prefect Sejanus, who then is kind of given the blame for the reign of terror, of making Rome essentially a police state. Then Sejanus is assassinated, or is officially condemned by the emperor. Caligula is named the official heir. Caligula becomes emperor, and then Caligula
Again, Caligula himself kind of comes in, and there's almost a breath of fresh air period there where
for the first year of his reign, it was seen as like, okay, he's gotten rid of like the records of who was enemies of the state. He's released a lot of the political prisoners that Tiberius had under lock and key. And he was genuinely seen as like, okay, he has good lineage. He is the son of Germanicus, this beloved general, brother of Claudius. And he's taken on the name Gaius in the grand tradition of Augustus and, well, Gaius Julius Caesar. So it's seen as like, yeah, it's going to be a real great time. Every day's a party.
And basically what happens, he gets very sick. He almost dies. He recovers and is never the same afterwards. We've got horses being appointed as consuls. I almost made a joke about the murder of his wife and daughter being the same person. That was sister and wife, as I remember correct.
Yeah, the records are fuzzy of, did he sleep with all of his sisters or just the one closest in age to him?
Okay. So that's what's going on right beforehand.
Yeah.
And here we are.
And I will say this, a lot of stuff from Caligula we get pretty much from after the Caligula history. Who would have thunk it? But it's always kind of with that grain of salt of, okay, was he mad or was he making fun of the Senate by saying, like, you're so useless, I would rather appoint my horse a senator? Is it some combination of the two? But it's generally assumed, like, no, he probably was very ill and a maniac.
So Claudius comes in, he's appointed. And his honeymoon period lasted 12 years, basically, is what you're...
I mean, he got married multiple times during that period, so yeah, it was pretty much a honeymoon.
Also, just competent administration.
Competent administration. He was very keen to create a bureau of freedmen, so these would be former slaves who would then be granted their rights and then sometimes made into official citizens of Rome, which is a very big deal. Like, I cannot stress how big of a deal citizenship was in Rome because they had to get there was practically a civil war of the fact of should we count other Italians as citizens of Rome.
So, what is anything else we need to do to talk about the importance of Claudius, or do we need to start thinking about what we think happens if they do pay attention to that man behind the curtain?
I think this was something you and I were just talking about beforehand of just the thing about Claudius is that he is important because of that stability for some time. And things were looking very volatile as we are about to get into the fork. So what changes could have been made if they made like Hamlet and stabbed that man in the curtain?
So,
dang it, it's not Claudius who gets stabbed in the curtain, it's Polonius. But you get what I'm going for with Hamlet.
So start. What happens? So if they actually, I think you and I talked about this as in reference to another hereditary ruler who, really wasn't cut out for it in the Romanovs, in that, do we think this is kind of what we talked about? I think was a senatorial coup organized and intentionally wiping out the Julio-Claudian line.
I believe that would be the case. It's essentially seen as this whole tree is corrupted. We gotta uproot it.
So, as we discussed, that basically, there's only two other possible people in the line, correct?
That is correct.
And one of them is Nero. He's 2 years old at this point. It didn't help Alexei Romanov, and it's not going to help him.
No.
So the senators come in and basically wipe out the entire imperial family, right? That's what we discussed.
Correct.
Then what?
Well, at this time, the current consul of the Senate. So, again, with Rome, like there's a Senate, but the Senate is mostly a rubber stamp, but it's a day job for the aristocrats to think they do something. And then the emperor would always play the game of like, I am a servant of the Senate. I am the prince of the Senate, and I'm just here as a stopgap. But, it's the Senate who's in charge. I just give ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't take them, I kill you. But the current consul is Gnaeus Sentius Saturnius. He is consul. And then his co-consul is Publius Pomponius Secundus, who was a close friend of Sejanus and was one of the political prisoners who was freed by Caligula. He was also the half-brother of Caligula's last wife.
Okay.
I guess they were not very close in that he decided, like, let's kill my brother-in-law.
I mean, who hasn't been there? Go on.
Exactly. And Secundus was the governor of Crete and what is now considered Libya.
Okay.
So he had political authority, and essentially they had agreed with the Praetorian prefect Caius Caria of let us try to reestablish the power of the Senate, that we have invested so much time and effort into the Julio-Claudians that we now need to return to what was the promise of Augustus, which was, hey, we're only going to be here for a short time, and then the Senate will be in charge.
How well does that work out?
Oh, it's horrible. It doesn't work out well at all. The Senate was doomed to fail for anybody who paid attention to late Roman Republic.
So it fails in that there's infighting? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying they fail because so there's infighting on one hand. There's a case to where any reforms that do try to get passed, like for example, the Gracchi brothers, any possible reforms that do try to get passed are inevitably going to be shot down by those entrenched in power. We're probably going to see a lot of infighting amongst the different territories who, if there's no emperor, why are we still a client state of Rome?
Mm-hmm.
And there's not really a good officer corps at this time because they were all promoted by Caligula. And so sometimes political cronies, not the best choice for general. Sometimes you get both, but not this time.
What happens? What's the outcome of this?
Oh, we're definitely seeing. Well, Chris, what we're going to see here from the north of Germany flying in here is the once Emperor Galba coming in with his northern army corps. In our timeline, when Claudius was declared emperor, people did say, "Hey, Galba, why don't you take over?" And Galba said, "No, I'm a good soldier." This is all according to Galba, by the way, who was seen as a stern disciplinarian and not a great time to be around. Galba did become emperor in our timeline, but at a much older age. I believe he was about 70 years old. And when he became emperor, he didn't give a donative grant to his soldiers. This was a whole thing as part of the client system, like you gave people gifts. We would call it a bribe these days, but back then it was just seen as good manners.
But
so
also just to think about this. So you're saying when he became emperor after the death of Nero, right?
Correct.
How many other people had become emperor without being adopted by the previous emperor? Basically, it sounds like Julius Caesar.
Zero.
Yeah,
Goose
Julius
egg.
Caesar. So it wasn't exactly an established practice yet, but it wasn't looked highly upon.
Right. The Romans prided themselves that they were not like the Egyptians in that it was a hereditary monarchy. But it was kind of like saying, well, we're not like them. And then saying, like, we have no plan on if the emperor dies. It's basically a free-for-all, but maybe adopted son.
And basically, the end of the Julio Claudians, the onset of Galba is somewhat what starts Rome as almost a military dictatorship, where you talk about people saying Galba should march on Rome. After this, every single time the emperor dies, every single general, no matter where they are, has somebody telling them that.
Yeah, and it gets to the point where I believe it's the crisis of the 2nd century, it becomes also very profitable to have your general become the emperor, and then you can assassinate him and bring in a replacement and get a whole new donative to your army corps, to the point it basically becomes just highest bidder.
Mm-hmm. So we're almost just pushing up an innovation here of the Roman political system that,
Correct.
Galba taking over as a younger man is not that big of a difference, because he eventually does take over. And when he does take over, it starts this period of general emperors.
Yeah, the only thing Galba has going for him is that he's younger, so he's able to establish himself more, and he has probably the best army out of potential rivals, because the Senate doesn't really have a strong army corps that they can call upon. And
Because right now, in the early empire, Germany is the only place where there's significant fighting. Is that a fair statement?
that is a very fair statement to say.
He's got the only army that's doing anything.
Yeah, he has the most experienced group, so maybe somebody gets very lucky once, but it's so unlikely that it's almost not worth considering. So
go ahead.
Oh, I'm just saying. So we have it to where there's maybe I'm going to give the Senate like a 5-year period in which they try to establish themselves. But I think,
and by the way, this is a 5-year period in which they're trying to, but they're busy fighting. This is not 5 years of pure senatorial rule. This is 5 years of anarchy where the Senate says they're doing this, and Galba's kind of going around knocking their heads in place.
Yeah, but at that point, we'll probably have Galba come in, establish himself. Whether he takes the title of emperor or he just says, I am the new dictator, it doesn't really matter.
So we talked about one other thing, that if you don't have a Claudius, this is super important. And I want to do a shout out to Alexis, who hasn't been able to join us for a while, but I'm sure this is kind of the crossover episode for her in the Roman Empire episode. We just talked about that Germany is the only place really in the entire Roman world where you're seeing fighting, where you actually have Roman troops doing anything other than sitting around. Um, and when we started this episode, or in the talking off, I mentioned that basically the geographic empire that was ruled over by Caligula was almost the exact same empire that had been ruled over by Augustus, that had been conquered by Julius Caesar. But there was only one exception. And what was that exception?
That sceptred isle, that throne of kings, England and Scotland. But yes, England.
England, because I don't know that, I mean, Hadrian's Wall is still seen as an unofficial border to Scotland.
Yeah. But yeah, Claudius, instead of declaring war on Poseidon slash Neptune, decided we should actually fight somebody. I'll conquer Britain.
And by the way, this is kind of an interesting choice of his, because Britain was the wild area that not even Julius Caesar had been able to conquer. So this was very much a solidifying moment for Claudius to go out there and show, you know what, I can do what even Julius Caesar couldn't. Um, in our timeline, if Galba is busy just solidifying his own power, do you think there is ever such a thing as Roman Britain?
I don't believe so. Like, maybe there's an expedition or two, but nobody really wants to commit to it because even I believe it was kind of an open secret between Augustus and Tiberius that they believed the empire can't get any bigger. Like there's nowhere really to expand to that is maintainable. But they always had to keep up the illusion of like, yes, the military, we are going to conquer the world.
I think there was also an aspect of they were already in power.
Yeah.
There, the fact that he went out and conquered was very important for Caesar being able to take power. If you have any general actually taking new territory for you, that person is instantly a threat to you. So maybe it's a good idea to not be training your replacements like that.
Yeah. That's
So
actually what happened in the Incan Empire.
yeah.
If you won too many times, it was a sure way to get executed.
Um. So what? So Claudius never conquers Britain. Britain is never brought into the Roman fold. Start talking a little bit about what that means.
So, a Britain without Rome, a Rome without Britain, what can be said? Well, namely, there's no King Arthur myth. You like Sword in the Stone? You think that's your favorite Disney movie? You're wrong. It's gone. Doesn't exist because a lot of the King Arthur myths are supposed to come from centurions who were left over in Britain after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. You want to know what's also not there? Constantine. Constantine grew up in Britain. Guess what? No conversion to Christianity from Constantine. Those are the two things I can think of right away, but there will be other things.
I think it's also important to hopefully this is going to be released next, and this is one of the things we talked about on the Room Where It Happened episode, that so many things in Western Europe tie back to the Roman Empire. And I feel like in Britain, not to compare them again to Russia, but a little bit like Russia, there's always historically this debate as to how European a country are we? Um, how tied to the continent are we? Are we more of a seafaring kind of focused elsewhere, or are we just, I mean, however far the Straits of Dover are? You see it in Brexit. Obviously, that's kind of the separation from the continent. You see it in a lot of both Churchill and Napoleon, the sense that we're engaging with the continent, but still distinctively different. Um, what does that do to Britain, to Britain's future, independent of the Roman Empire? Does it, first and foremost, and you touch on it a little bit with Constantine, while Constantine may not convert to Christianity and spread it throughout the entire empire, he certainly isn't going to spread it to Britain. If the importance of the Roman emperor or the Roman Empire as a vehicle, as a host to spread Christianity throughout Europe, even if that does happen under another emperor, Britain's not part of that, right?
Nope, wouldn't be a part of that. Britain also might not be, like you were saying with the culture, might not even be able to bring in that system of just having administrative governance brought in, because it was kind of like one of those last Gaelic holdouts of just very decentralized authority throughout their group. So without that history of, having a system in place, they potentially have a much different form of government than anything we could really conceive of for that time period. But definitely,
When you just mentioned it being so decentralized, something else goes through my mind. Um, I mentioned earlier that while it's not the official border, Hadrian's Wall, which is built much later than what we're talking about, but it is a Roman innovation in Britain, is sometimes the almost the cultural border between England and Scotland.
yeah,
Is
seen
there
almost as an iron curtain between
Mhm.
the dark happenings of the North.
Is there an England? Is there an if I mean this is, and I think we're unique amongst Americans in that we actually know, the again, Alexis, please, we'd love to hear from you again. The concentric circles of England versus Britain versus Great Britain versus the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. That these are the inclusion of these different things. Many people, here use England as interchangeable for the British Isles, part of that is because England is almost is a very is the I don't want to trigger this hate mail, but is one of the very important, almost predominant politically entities in Great Britain because the Romans unify it. Because the Romans create a single political entity out of this decentralized structure you're talking about, is
Yeah.
why there is an entity such as England.
And it's also because those same Romans then later hired Western German tribes to come in and serve as mercenaries, that we even have the English language.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think it's pretty important. The a stutterer hiding behind a curtain could be why there is in England. Um, is anything else? I mean, is that kind of where we want to leave it? Is there any other thread you want to pull on a bit?
Let me ask you, how long do you think Rome lasts? Do you think it lasts as long as it did in our timeline, or do you think it's doomed to just be decentralized itself with the different regions splitting, almost like what happened with the Macedonians?
I think it, it I don't think it changes too terribly much. We did talk about Britain. I don't think necessarily that Britain meant much to the empire as a whole. It was a little bit of a periphery. Um, I do think it's an interesting thought that if there never was a senatorial coup, a senatorial grab for power. After Augustus, senators know their place. I think here it came close, and I think it would be interesting to think about future Roman emperors. I did say that anytime an emperor dies, there's always somebody by a local general saying they should march on Rome. There's also going to be somebody by senators saying you, as the metropole, should try and establish yourself. And they're very different skill sets, leading an army versus leading the Senate. And I think if there was a historical precedent for a metropole versus a military dynamic, I think it's definitely possible that there are more situations like this. Um, I get back to my favorite person, or kind of the person that got me on the podcast. I always do want to say that the decisions would be made not by speeches and resolutions, but by blood and iron. The fact is, once you've unleashed political violence, I hate to say this, but there's always going to be a certain advantage to the general. Um, so I think, you know what I'm saying?
There's a reason why Oliver Cromwell became de facto ruler of Britain after they killed Charlie the First.
Yes, I yeah. Um, I think it complicates successions. We had talked about a little bit. This isn't quite a traditional military dictatorship, but it's certainly a lot closer than kind of the example of an Egyptian, or throw this out there, any other monarchy, um, where it's a official lineage. So it complicates these transitions. I think you're going to see possible instances where senators may be able to elevate themselves by balancing these powers. But these are all patterns, and these are all um things you see in our timeline, in the actual history. And I think it's very much a matter of the stresses that they were put under by the barbarian migrations that changed that.
Yeah.
What about you? Do you think it changes anything on on the kind of overall arc of Roman history?
I The only thing I can really think of is what happens on the periphery, really, of the empire, because you and I talked a little bit about the Jewish revolt that was going to happen in 20 years' time. At this point, Herod Agrippa, there are a ton of Herods, by the way, in this time period, so we're not talking about the Herod you think we're talking about. Herod Agrippa, the best character on I, Claudius, uh, was in charge there, and he had to try and talk Caligula out of putting a statue of himself in the Great Temple. So whether rulers like him, who were given a wide berth because of their friendships with the emperors, would then say, well, now we're free to just break off from that because who is really in control of the armies? I, I could see like the empire becoming a smaller political entity, just kind of staying in Western Europe. But
is this a couple of peripheral provinces breaking off, or is this the kind of the separations we saw under Domitian and Constantine?
I'm going to go with small separations under Domitian and Constantine.
So actual divisions of the empire, or individual provinces kind of spinning off?
I'm going with individual provinces spinning off,
Okay.
Chris. That's where I'm taking my stand. This is my San Juan Hill.
Okay. So yeah, anything else you'd like to do with this idea?
Trying to think if Marcus Aurelius would be a thing. I've had so many guys.
I think Marcus Aurelius would absolutely be a thing. I think he's, I talked about there not being the same skill set between a metropole, a senator, a political philosopher, and a general. That doesn't mean they can't be expressed in the same person. And if they are, that person definitely has an inbuilt advantage in the system.
That's very true. And it was still mostly the senatorial classes where future emperors came up.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that was part of the system set in by... Who fought Marius again? Cato? Was it Cato and Marius?
Sulla.
Sulla. Because Sulla had essentially created a system for the aristocrats to ideally have everybody rise through it like a meritocracy for the aristocracy. It drives me crossy with all of them. But it's just so difficult to say what the ultimate consequences would be. But I just see a small dissolution just because there would always be this power vacuum. That's never going to get any better because it's not a hereditary monarchy. And I feel very strange arguing for hereditary monarchy right now. So...
Or it's also going to be, like we talked about, once in people's minds you can break up the empire. You're going to have generals just kind of, not just your Herod Agrippas, you're going to have generals setting themselves up in certain areas. You're going to have, I could easily see the German areas under Roman control. The emperor,
Well, especially because there were so many Gauls in that time who were brought into the Senate by Claudius because he had done a lot to expand it to bring them into the power structure. That basically it just kind of feels like a soft reboot to late era Roman Republic where it's just, yeah, there's a Senate, but it's the dictator who's calling the shots, but we don't call him a king.
The more they change, the more these are saying the same, I'm hearing.
Exactly. What I'm saying is Tarkin, my Grand Moff Tarkin might just be Grand Moff Caligula if we want to switch it up a bit.
Okay. I think we did hit some interesting points, though, especially the England thing. But if you don't have anything else, let's go ahead and close it the way we normally do and suggest to listeners, if they were to come to a fork in the road, what should they do?
Use it to stab Claudius. I mean, take it. Take it.
All right, everyone. Yes, use it to stab Claudius. Look forward to seeing you guys on the next podcast.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.